Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Prudent Observations. I am joined today with my wonderful guest, Semiogogue. We've kind of been busy these last few weeks together, which has been great. But last but not least, the long-awaited discussion on de-globalization is finally here. Oliver, how are you doing?
I am finer than frog's hair and twice as slippery. How about you, Prude?
I'm doing quite well. Glad to have you on again, this time with a little more of our continuation of geopolitical discussion rather than just ringing in the New Year's. So if you haven't missed it, Oliver and I have been busy with Charlemagne covering Poland, Prometheanism, and the 3 Cs initiative, which we'll hopefully cover soon. But we planned this a few weeks back prior to the new year, and our schedules finally allow it to happen. And I thought that in the midst of...
That's very, very kind of you, Prude. My schedule torpedoed everything.
My schedule's also messed up, too, because I have stuff to record with Turn Up tomorrow, and then I have my father's side's Christmas tomorrow, sort of family get together, and then my mother's side with my grandmother on Sunday evening. So it's all it all worked out perfect.
All's well that ends well, as my grandmother says.
That's absolutely true. So in prepping for this, because I've had some time to look over it, I've noticed that this term deglobalization did not just emerge out of the ether with regards to the reaction to the pandemic or the supply chain crises that has been decades in the making. The Wharton Business School had a really great talk about this back in March of 2022, talking about how, one of the consequences of globalization is that we sacrificed sustainability and durability to economic shocks through globalization since the 1990s. And so every time that there's been a shock to the global economy, whether it be from COVID, whether it be from war, whether it be from the dot-com bubble to the Euro crisis in 2009, the conversation has always reshifted back to deglobalizing the economy. How can we make ourselves more independently resilient? And the Council of Foreign Relations a few months back were talking about that very same problem. And I always tell people that you should always listen to what the elites are saying, because they typically publish everything that they do. It's when they stop publishing that you should be worried. But their conversation was oriented around, and this was with the president at the time, Council of Foreign Relations, Richard Haas, well-known diplomat, worked with the Bush administration, the slimiest character you can imagine. And he had noticed that their rhetoric was oriented around, well, this discussion over deglobalization is troubling because we feel like we can make the system more effective post-COVID. We can make it more effective in regards to global integration of trade. They want to resume the conversations about things like what the Trans-Pacific Partnership was supposed to be, a greater integration of the global economy. But they find that it's concerning that we're returning back to this. Once another economic shock happens, everyone scatters. And I think that that's sort of an interesting discourse that we have today because, well, what has 2022 been but a year of shocks and people scattering to their own traditions or their own nations and what comes first, and nations trying to bring others back into the international fold. And that's been the war in Ukraine and the impact that that's had on the global economy as the rest of the world tries to recover from the last 2 years. And so I thought, why not have a conversation about this? Because Oliver's one of the most well-versed geopol people I know in these spheres. And so I thought, well, let's dive into it. So, the traditional definition that we hear is deglobalization is the process or the policies of diminishing interdependence and integration between global institutions or economic relationships between countries. And I think that we've seen a lot of that happen in the last year, 2022. And I was just wondering where you wanted to maybe dive in there from what you've been observing, especially since we've covered the war throughout all of last year, and we will in the future. Our recent discussions on Poland, I thought that this is sort of a good segue before we get into that next one.
Yes, no doubt, because one of the interesting things that we're seeing is Ukraine sort of standing in for a whole band of Eastern Europe and whether or not it'll fall in, Russia's sphere of influence or Europe's sphere of influence. And we can imagine, either outcome. But what's more interesting is the idea, as we discussed in our last stream with Charlemagne as well, in which we will pick up in future in a part 2. It seems as though that region may well get peeled off from both Europe and Russia, and have an increasing sort of U.S. focus there. Anyway, that's one line of speculation that we looked at when we were talking this last time about Prometheanism. So yeah, it's interesting to think about, the splitting and the reaggregating of power blocks, and that certainly does seem to be central to this whole idea of deglobalization, whether you conceive of it as something that's undertaken purposefully, as a result of policy, to face circumstances, or if you view it more as I do, which is simply what they call it, what the inner party is calling in its discussions with the outer party, the upcoming things that will have to eventually be acknowledged as facts. So to me, deglobalization has the ring of something that was coined some time back. I took a look at the Ngram viewer, and I could, see it coming in around 1994. That's back during the period of the Gulf War stuff. The original aspects of that, with pushing Hussein out of Kuwait and then establishing those 2 no-fly zones well before the Iraq War proper. And you can see how it kind of goes up and down. I think it hits a kind of a peak, if I'm remembering right, around 2008, and then drops down again. And then it goes skyrocketing off again in the neighborhood of 2014, which is, interestingly, a period where we saw all kinds of things happening in Ukraine. But it's a term that's been around for a while. And without being able to go look at the actual instances upon which these counts are based, in order to get a sense of the change in context, whether it was, whether it referred to the exact opposite thing we might imagine now, because it's conceivable it did, or at least something in a totally parallel dimension that we can't get a one-for-one correspondence with. We don't know exactly what the term meant when it appeared, but it's been in play for a while. And to me, it seems like what they say in order to contextualize a process that isn't marching towards the outcome of global integration and uniting all under heaven that they might have hoped for. And so to me, it seems like a framing, as I said, where the inner party comes to address the outer party. Maybe it's a webinar put forth by the World Economic Forum to prepare journalists or policymakers, to help them envision this in the right way, or to frame the arguments and the concepts that are germane in all of this. To me, it stinks of framing. But if there is a much more focused way in which this term is used, specifically the idea that you will proactively enact policies that insulate you, for example, from supply chain shocks or other associated shocks, then that's an area where my broader, more cynical breakdown of things like semantics and messaging and the rest might not carry us as far as we need to go. And I suspect it's precisely in those areas I just mentioned that you've been digging, right?
Yeah, no. The interesting thing is that when this term really props up, it props up in a very specific economic context. So one of the things that we've noticed is, especially out of geopolitical and scholars and those that have worked in government, like Edward Luttwak, who have famously coined the term geoeconomics to replace the traditional power political process that we see between great powers and to be more oriented around the economy. Because in his view, that economic structures are going to be one of the more dominant factors in the coming decades from the 1980s onward, as sort of an old-fashioned Cold Warrior. And when he talks about this, his argument is oriented around that political systems are going to functionally serve around how you accumulate capital, because in sort of an anarchic global system, accumulation of capital means revenue. It means the ability to fund resources, to extract resources, trade with other nations, and most importantly, attain sustainable survivability for the nation state. And so the times that I've seen from 1992 onward, for instance, there's a really good article from the American political scientist Joseph Nye, who's well known for using the term liberal hegemony. He wrote back in 2001, but he also talked about it in 1995, that one of the things that we're going to see in the midst of greater globalized economies is that nation states are most likely going to see punishments by larger powers for getting involved in war. And he was citing about American involvement in things like Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo, East Timor. And in the same way, kind of prophetically, he writes, I think this rather key moment, that he says, today, many observers describe the state of global military interdependence as unipolar. That is, only one country truly has global military reach with air, naval, and ground forces that includes almost 300,000 troops in Europe, Asia, and near the Persian Gulf. Even 1/3 reduction since the Cold War, the U.S. military expenditures exceed the defense budgets of the next 5 countries combined. In today's unipolar world, the Cold War strategic chessboard is gone. Instead, as Thomas Friedman, a journalist for the New York Times, argues, an electronic herd of investors creates disincentives for conflict. According to this view, because countries are punished for fighting, regional conflicts are more likely to become ghettoized than globalized. Now, this was in 2001, where our concept of proxy wars and conflicts has not evolved to where it is today. And I think that we're seeing the evolution of this term evolve, where, for instance, the Richard Haas in the Council of Foreign Relations talk in June of last year, he was oriented around the fact that we talk about globalization and de-globalization, but for everyone focusing on trying to divest or decouple from the world economy, every other part of these widespread multinational involved institutions like the World Health Organization, the United Nations General Assembly, they're still going full steam ahead. So one of the things that I've noticed, especially in a contemporary context, is that this seems to be a rather well-inclined avenue to sort of, use as a political release valve, saying that, well, in our, for instance, right, the USA CHIPS Act, we're trying to engage in great power competition with the Chinese over semiconductor manufacturing. Well, that's us attempting to de-globalize ourselves, to be less interdependent. We're focusing on the national security state. We're not being focused on, international trade and how we can benefit with one another. We're back to sort of, in the trenches type kind of policy. And that's the sort of rhetoric I've seen being used here.
Yeah, I think at the outset, it's probably worth exploring whether we're on the same page as regards the idea of unrestricted warfare. So, of course, this takes into account all kinds of other things that you certainly and probably most of the viewers are well familiar with. Ideas
I would hope so. We covered that book just a couple weeks ago with Raging Mandrill on your recommendation, so they should know the book.
Right on. Yeah. Well, of course, it was recommended to me by no less a figure than Steve Bannon, and it wasn't in person. I was just watching a video. But yeah, some years back I picked it up because my friend Tim had mentioned that it's basically to rip off Mark Twain. It's the art of war brought down to date. And under that model, it's not quite the same thing as fifth generation warfare, economic warfare, propaganda warfare, or even fighting for the hearts and minds. It's the idea, as you well know, that it's all warfare all the time in every domain of life. Absolutely nothing, as we've seen with arguably with things like the coup, nothing isn't a domain that involves this war, whether it's a political, social, or even a hot war, military, kinetic dimension. But the most important thing is that this fight is going on at all times behind the scenes. And as you pointed out, economics was probably the main thrust of it during the period of the Cold War. But at that time, there were two blocks, right? Again, I'm just trying to set the stage here, and you stop me where you feel like there's a significant fork in your thinking. So we get this business of the Soviet Union collapsing, and there's my friend Tim made the argument that the Soviets simply had to do it, and they pretended to collapse. He compared it to their withdrawing as far as the Urals to allow the invading forces to sort of ravage things further westward, metaphorically speaking. People like Thomas 777, whom I respect, and I certainly respect his reading and knowledge of specifically this kind of stuff. He doesn't buy that at all. He believes that it just simply fell. In any case, it either did or it pretended to. And certainly, as we've seen from the economic consequences, you can say it was fake or real, but for the guy, dying on a park bench in a Moscow winter in the mid 90s, with cirrhosis and no work, taped up in plastic bags to try to stay warm, I'm sure it would feel pretty real to him. So at that point, enter the idea of a unipolar world. And oddly enough, right around this time where we're starting to try on the outfit of a unipolar world, man, we'll get what's his name, Schwarzenegger, to play a Russian cop in Red, whatever it is. He comes to the U.S. and hangs out with Jim Belushi, and they're good buddies because there's a new future in front of us, right? These walls are coming down. So you have the idea of a unipolar world. You have an idea of this clear trajectory now that this great obstacle has been removed. China at this point was not recognized as having risen to a level where it constituted any kind of a threat, right? We were supposed to put our shoulder to help lift them up. Well, right around this time, we see the appearance of the word deglobalization. So it seems to be kind of a weasel word from the outset, designed to describe anything that gets in the way of what they then at that time imagined was the inescapable trajectory of history, right? That this is Fukuyama days, man. And so deglobalization appears as this way that you can describe any hiccups you might run into, but really what it seems to describe to me is anything that gets in the way of uniting all under heaven. Now, you pointed out the parallel or the more global institutions that have been around for quite some time traditionally, whether it's United Nations or things like the World Health Organization. They existed even during the period of the Cold War. So I can see where the competing powers would want to keep them in place because they do permit certain things to be done, certain conversations to be had, certain, maneuvering to take place. But what's different was that there was a unipolar world. And then we see these weird, we see the appearance of the term deglobalization. Then we see these spikes at different times, as you pointed out quite rightly, whenever there's, real static and people particularly worried about things like war. Or, major things like whole economic sectors, seeming to go to pieces with Asian tigers or whatever. They begin to think, oh, well, it might be necessary to pull back to protect ourselves. Well, that becomes deglobalization. I think what we're seeing now, and then I'll just turn it over to you, tell you to see if you, if all of this, passes muster for you. What we're seeing now is a situation where powers that have the ability not just to say no, but also to mean it, have risen up and pushed back in certain respects against the United States, primary and allied countries, and the West in general. And that's primarily Iran, Syria, Russia, of course, itself, and those in their orbit, and then kind of playing an outside game, not fully desynchronizing, but possibly doing their own thing now as China. And so we get a spike in this idea of deglobalization. But to me, again, it looks like how the outer party gets to hear about what's going to come from the inner party that has a better handle on planning. And yeah, it seems all about framing. Whereas if we remember the idea of unrestricted warfare, the fight has never stopped. And the things that you describe as being primarily economics or economic focused have always been a part of this very war. Again, as we saw with the Cold War. And tech is the last piece. I think we're going to have to look at the tech differential before we went to unipolar, right? Which people would argue brought down the Soviet Union, Star Wars, the gap in technology, the fear that we could put together a missile shield. Then they collapse or seem to collapse, or a little bit of both. And suddenly you get Western investment, tech starts coming in. China has stolen tons of our tech and had it handed over in more traditional manufacturing processes. Russia has learned quite a bit in the meantime as well. Now it looks like the walls could be going back up again, what everybody calls Cold War II. And, maybe deglobalization is just another way to say Cold War II. But so what are your
I'm
thoughts on
beginning
all
to
of
think a
this?
little bit of that, though, based off of the literature that I've been reading. So, for instance, there was a gentleman in the University of Islamabad back in Pakistan in 2011 that was writing about this, and he called it Deglobalization and the Realist State. And he says that in periods of great economic uncertainty, coupled with a geopolitical crisis, nation states will always pretty much bring an end to any kind of quote unquote laissez-faire or non-interventionist system with the economy. He writes that the economic crisis has moved the political tide into new directions where the role of the state expands. And he's talking about the 2009 crisis. Well, in the same way that we've watched with the pandemic and now the war in Ukraine, and most likely what we're going to see is this increased competition economically with China, that there's going to be, again, this what they call deglobalization, these decouplings, these depairings, and attempts to re-securitize the necessary things that they find necessary for national security. So whether that means we're going to start investing in, microprocessing plants here, we're going to encourage our allies to move, for instance, the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company to set up companies and to set up manufacturing plants in Arizona or in Japan, while supporting our allies like the Japanese to help remilitarize and bolster their support, which they have gotten more support now with this new government in hand. And at the same time, they're really putting to test the perennial question of economic interdependence. Now, in 2018, and I tell people to read this book all the time because it poses an amazing question and an amazing theory. It's called Economic Interdependence and War by Dale C. Copeland. And he argues that throughout all the decades that we've seen a more globalized Bretton Woods system, that we see two kind of debates bring up. Liberals will tell you that economic interdependence decreases the likelihood of war, that traditional rules-based economic liberal order that we see in terms of the globalized economy. That more people are brought in, the less likely they want to pay the costs incurred by either sanctions, low-level conflicts, or trade conflict. The argument you'll hear from the realist school of international relations is that actually no, the economic interdependence actually increases the likelihood of conflict because you don't know if that guy is going to use that leverage against you. Copeland makes the argument that it's neither of those two arguments that get the full picture. It's the expectation of trade relations. If you expect them to go bad, expect yourself to engage in some kind of conflict or prepare yourself for some kind of war. Now, Copeland argues that war ranges in two ways. One, it's either trade war, or secondly, more likely standard military conflict. I think, though, in an age where all kind of warfare is information, it's based on the medics, it's based on our talking points, even the media that we can consume or retweet is part of the same kind of narrative stuff that we've been watching, especially with the war in Ukraine right now over the last year. All of that plays a role into how conflicts are maintained, especially with information. And so what I think we're seeing is people trying to answer Copeland's question. They expect that, our trade relationship, especially since Trump and the Biden administration's actually doubled down on our trade war with China, that we're going to be, expecting a similar kind of conflicts. And they're trying to decouple that to sort of soften the blow, despite the fact that, I think China's kind of up to that game. That's why I think one of my bigger predictions for the 2020s is going to be the emphasis on South America, because China is the largest investor in the lithium triangle and that faces towards the Pacific Ocean. And so I think that's really what we're seeing here is deglobalization is just a nice political term for, we need to securitize these things, the national security state. We're going to play a big role in the economy, whether you like it or not.
Well, let me throw in, certainly nothing I could contest there. I haven't read the material, and the people to whom you refer are, obviously they make a career of following all this stuff. And, You know, you could see what my career looks like. I don't even show up as well dressed as Prude, man. So yes, my apologies, ladies and gentlemen. I feel like I showed up, at a white tie with a black tie. Well, but when this guy you're referring to, or the various guys you referred to, talk about conflict being more or less likely, here's where I want to jump in and again assert this idea of unrestricted warfare. It's a certain kind of conflict. Um, are we to imagine that if we take at face value the notion this first one of these guys sets forth, which is that our economic interdependence makes the likelihood of war or conflict less likely, what's going on under that scenario? If we accept it at face value, is it just a situation where both the multipolar arrangement, this unipolar guaranteed rules-based international order, where the U.S. Navy makes sure that the trade routes stay open, right? And by gum, anybody who needs gas will get it. And then otherwise, you've got these different states doing their things under the umbrella of this unipolar power, this globalizing, which simply means centripetal rather than centrifugal, right? This gathering of all things into networks that are interrelated, eventually all the different nodes that are established have beneath them slaved nodes further, and then at the top you begin to build a single node, though people fight for their influence within it, as happened with the League of Nations and then United Nations and these institutions, the other attempts to kind of gather it all together. Let's imagine all that's happening just like they say. Is it just like Israel's like, oh, it's cool, whatever Iran wants to do, we don't need warfare. We're economic. We don't have to worry about that. We're economically independent. As a matter of fact, war isn't even happening right now. Look at all the ways in which today, like a textbook example, what's going on in Ukraine is in fact like a layered cake of different warfighting techniques. You've got huge propaganda, I mean, through the roof, just as we saw with the coup. That was a bit of unintentional rhyme. But look at the way in which the economic warfare is so just outrageously in your face. Somebody just went and blew up the one of the Nord Stream pipelines, so the economic aspect, the energy aspect, the stuff we talked about with Prometheanism, all of the investment that's going into the 3Cs initiative, which seems to be more the economic block of it, is the kind of thing that we're seeing in Ukraine cannot be separated from the warfighting capabilities of the nations, like, electric trains being used to, move heavy equipment and troops around. You screw with the energy infrastructure, then the electric trains don't work anymore, and you got to break out some new steam ones, right? I guess what I'm saying, to make it as concise as possible, that ship has sailed. Even when they say that we're dealing with it on an economic level and conflict isn't happening, what I'm trying to get across in my ham-fisted way is that, in fact, the war is twice as ferocious. It's just taking place at the level of economics. So you got Chinese buying U.S. bonds and hoping that gives them some leverage, and then finding out, no, in fact, what it did was give the U.S. leverage over China. These kinds of games, the kind of currency games that'll, screw with national finances the way Soros did to make his first big fortune. It's just as bloody. It's just as fierce and merciless and driving towards the same thing as kinetic warfare. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing is that when you say securitize, in the sense of worrying about our supply chains or whether or not we'll be able to get certain types of pharmaceuticals, the kind of stuff we just had to deal with recently and doubtless will again. Yes, there's trying to secure the supply chains, but all these things are interrelated. So securing economic supply chains has national security implications, as just about anybody who has a buck hanging on that outcome of it will argue, right? Give me your money because national security. But at the same time, there's also the idea of having to ensure that you have certain technology that's been kept for you. Well, actually, let me just pull it because I put it in a tweet once, and if I can steal just another minute, I tried to put this out, and this is my main angle on this. Is I thought back. You remember I was telling you I'm trying to come up with something on deglobalization because I don't want to just be like a dumbass here, because you've done a lot more reading on it. But I was thinking back about what kind of players might have backed Trump, right? And he came in and was, all about returning industrial capacity to the United States. And so I thought, well, if you've got service-related stuff, banking and technocrats over on one side, then you have these old dynasties, these families like Krupps, or, I don't know who controls Siemens, if anybody does anymore. Once upon a time, your Fords or your Westinghouses, right? And those people, to whatever extent they survive, and it might not be in the foreground, it might be behind the scenes, they're the ones who have the most to lose from a globalized situation where, for example, their entire focus, which is heavy industry, gets moved to one zone of the world. And we're seeing that just doesn't fly, because then all your tanks come from one place. Well, then you get to see who makes the real decisions when the rubber meets the road, right? And those people overlap with the military-industrial complex. So basically, 4 competing zones, let's not call them nations at this point. Although an interesting thing is I went and tried to look up what the opposite, the antonym of deglobalization is. And all that the various thesauri or whatever could come up with was nationalization, which is rather interesting. And what we're seeing now is not necessarily that, but whatever these zones are, even if they're not nations, they have to maintain the ability to develop weapons of which the potential enemy have no knowledge. That's life or death. And so here you see that the military-industrial complex overlaps the old industrialist dynasties. So, I'm not sure of that. I don't know if there's some family behind Raytheon, right? But certainly there have to be some families behind the scenes that long have associations with these big state organizations, or some kind of power block that does get transmitted over time in terms of control, or who generally manages these things, or who really can say yes and no at the end of the day in these organizations. They'd be threatened by this. The military-industrial complex, which seems to correspond in some respects to the neocons and their interests, right? They would have to be like, well, there's only a certain distance that we can carry this idea of globalization until we are absolutely victorious on the battlefield one day, that day is probably going to take place near Harmegiddo, not quite the battlefield we all want to be on. They're going to want to maintain their ability to have their own secret weapons production that the rest of the world doesn't know about. And that's going to require some kind of a territorial allegiance, so you can determine who can work in the companies and who can't. And a lot of that stuff has gone out the window recently. And there's been all kinds of industrial espionage and all kinds of usual crap. Also, the countries need to keep their own industrial capacity, their technological trajectory, their edge. And yet now we see a situation by simply having a kinetic war break out, and perhaps CUF too, which came right before this and has its own questions. Was that a globalizing thing? Was it a deglobalizing thing? Was it both simultaneously in some respects, right? At any rate, setting that one aside, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too, the war and industry and supply chain aspect that we're seeing today, much of this shift is being forced into everyone's awareness simply because another country said no and we'll fight over it, which brought back all these old things that everybody pretended you didn't have to care about anymore. Like the fact that you have better weapons than the other guys and they don't know about it. How does that even exist in this putatively globalist system?
That last part kind of makes me laugh, because there's one of my guilty pleasures or vices, I'll admit, is that I like to play like an aircraft fighter simulation game known as War Thunder. Is a free-to-play game, but they want all the stats to be accurate, and people have literally leaked classified weapons information about certain aircraft and tanks to make the game more realistic and getting them in trouble. And I'm sure, like, that's probably one part as to how they can get information leaked across. But in regards, because you mentioned the pandemic, and if that's globalization or deglobalization, and for what I have been reading, both from the Council of Foreign Relations, the WHO, and some other articles I had whipped through, because JSTOR is great because I can log in with my channel email on Google and get 99 free articles a month. It's fantastic. My library is huge. PDFs, but And they had argued that actually the rapid rate of transmission of coronavirus, whether lab leak or whatever, all because of globalization made it very quick for that to spread to be a global pandemic for what it was. In the same way that in the midst of a globalized war in 1918, Spanish influenza more or less did the same thing. And that is always coupled as a negative consequence, is just a price that you have to pay as a net benefit when it comes to more globalized economies having foreign direct investment for manufacturing, mining, development in, say, sub-Saharan African or Central African countries. That was a report that I was reading on earlier. They said, this came in the Horizons Journal of International Relations and Sustainable Development, written by none less than the former CIA head, Ian Bremmer. And he was talking about the impact that globalization has in regards to developing markets, because globalization accelerates access to, say, other medical issues like microbial resistant bacteria or diseases that are traditionally associated with Africa. He said that globalization had led to rapid response from, like, the Obama administration when everyone was really panicking about an Ebola outbreak here in the United States, because that's considered to be unheard of. And that sort of stuff can always be overlapped with geopolitical interests as well, because you have to defend the nation state if you lead a government, and that tends to be the case. What I find really interesting about that, too, is that coronavirus isn't the first example. Neither was Ebola. You had all types of flu scares. SARS was mentioned as well in that article, to go back even earlier, because that's the first
swine
one.
flu, bird
swine flu, bird flu, SARS, MERS. All these things are listed, right, as a consequence of globalization. And they say, well, we just have to take it with it, because the real benefit is all the medical process and the ways that we can globalize health and make sure that there's more monitoring, more access, the same kind of digital biomedical security state stuff that we got really concerned about over in 2020 and beyond. But has
almost like there was a trajectory.
Yeah, almost as makes you wonder a little bit. But that tends to be the case. And it also, the other thing that I've noticed in this conversation about globalization and deglobalization is that while it often gets paired with, like, security, national security, or securitization of industries, or, like you said, nationalizing industries, the words in which you use, right, your language, your rhetoric, the things that you might be up to snuff on better than myself, is that also plays a role into it. And so when I was listening to the Council of Foreign Relations talks, they says, well, there's going to be deglobalization aspects in regards to nations taking care of their economies or their national security, but there are still going to be parts of globalization that continue. And the Council of Foreign Relations president at the time was talking to what his name is, Sergio Alcocer. He works with the Mexican consulate of internet. It's either with the Mexican consulate, or he works with some other organization, I think a think tank now. But he was talking about how, well, the other parts of globalization that we're going to still see continue are things focused on climate change, things that tend to be slanted towards the Western world. And one of the things that I've noticed has to be ESG, the environmental social governance, where there's been a lot of focus on that. And it gets the knock and jock into that these are political tools to maintain sort of your global image on the world scale. Because at the end of the day, in this system that we live in the world system that we deal with, great powers still wield, much more influence than smaller nations. And so American foreign policy, in my viewpoint, has a aspect of deterritorialization to it, to where, we uproot cultures and ideas and traditions and languages. This is why Emmanuel Macron of France says that Americanization is a problem, because all of a sudden our narratives change based upon what can placate the domestic polity at home. And what's the domestic polity at home concerned about? Well, we went from fighting the Taliban and kicking Saddam Hussein out in 2003 to somewhere around 2008, 2009. We were talking more and more about girls' schools and women's education, and later on gay rights in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it kind of provided a rhetorical and political post hoc justification for our reason being there, in the same way that we kind of had an interest in Afghanistan, even more so after that 2010 U.S. Geological Survey about Afghanistan's mineral wealth. So you compare the good parts, they would argue the elites, not necessarily ourselves, about globalization, movement of bodies, the movement and access of technology that comes with free trade. But you also have to take the bad with it. And in this day and age, in the midst of a coming recession, this is where all the discourse from those in think tanks and in Washington and other global institutions are moving towards that. Well, on one hand, yes, we take the good with the bad, but the bad means renewed great power competition.
Well, take a look, for example, like you mentioned, the thing about deterritorialization. That's only deterritorialization for the people who are being uprooted and dragged onto the network. They're the globalization network, right? Like we've seen what happens when you get on any standard setting network, like Twitter's the main one, right? You can suck wind out in the outer darkness, right? If you're not on Twitter, you know, Telegram has its moments, but it's not the same experience. You don't have the same access, and Gab, no. So how does globalization differ really in certain respects from monopolization? Or having one gang that controls everything, right? We call it the syndicate, Luigi. And what happens when we don't globalize, which means get on the network that everything's supposed to be on? Well, we find ourselves cut off of the network, which is why in some of the things that you've been reading, you see mention of things like ghettoization, because that's what they'll do to a country that doesn't get with the program, like Serbia or Iran, right? And I'm certainly no fan of Venezuela, but Venezuela's another one vis-a-vis the West that they play these games with. So it's deterritorialization only for the people who've been uprooted. For those who dragged you onto the network, well, your ass is theirs. What's happened is you've been territorialized. You have been made subject, right? And that, I think, is something worth bearing in mind. As for the idea of the players and thinking about whether or not they're going to take the good, because whether or not they're going to put up with the bad because with it comes the good. I think there's a lot of that kind of thing that you're going to continue to see going, like accepting some green bullshit or puzzling and scratching your head at the fact that the Russians and the Israelis were perfectly happy to coof up their populations. I think what's probably happened is to make those things viable. The people who are out there selling them to the elites, the kind of like, I work directly with Mr. Blair. I'm so happy to be able to sit down with you gentlemen today and tell you about the future that's inevitable, right? It's inevitable because it's going to work for you and it's going to work for me, right? And how's it going to work for us? Because this is the way that things are going to go in the future, and it's going to yield this ability to study in granular detail this thing and to ensure your profitability and increase it. It's like a bunch of Roman tax farmers getting together and saying, we can all agree on squeezing them, right? So I think what happens is you just have because it's a viable idea, somebody like a Putin or a Xi or a whoever, Rouhani, I don't even know who is or was in Iran. Anyway, the point is they'll look at it and they'll go, well, yeah, kind of at this top level where we really make decisions about how we're going to milk the aphids, I think there are really good reasons to pursue something like this. Then what happens, it's like, well, okay, who's going to get to have their hand on the steering wheel and be in charge of it? right? Who's going to have the shares that are actually voting stock? And then what happens is they say, well, climate change is so important to me, as is public health and public health databases. And, the idea of, bodies and international bodies that share data in order to ensure that these standards are met in international travel, these people don't want to be kicked off the gravy train when it's going somewhere that looks like, it could be a good thing, but they're going to want to split it. So they say, yeah, absolutely, we're perfectly willing to help with climate change, but this is going to be handled by Russian scientists and implemented based on a Russian schedule or a Chinese schedule or a US, whatever, right? So in that respect, they could seem as though they're continuing towards this thing because it makes sense. Like you were talking about, the way you sell it to the wider public really matters. You don't want to look like you're the one country that doesn't care about, the 15 colored speckled hee-haw out of the Amazon basin. They've all died because of the action you didn't take, you barbarian. But you're not going to want the centralized control to leave your hands. And so again, we see a situation where, yeah, we can agree on these general things. Let's keep the United Nations in place. We can all mouth platitudes about green, but we've got to divide it up into our respective zones. And then as soon as you add a hot war to this, because all those things I was just talking about, as you well know, this is decades that shit's been going on, these back and forth in these games, right? But as soon as you get a hot war big enough to be causing economic havoc in Russia, Europe, and the United States, certainly, I don't know to what extent it's hit countries like Canada or New Zealand or something, right? But presumably this hits everybody a little bit, and some of us pretty hard. And Ukraine and Russia, are getting it. Europe's getting it. As soon as that comes into play, then you've activated everything else I was talking about that ranges from your mention of securitization over to the idea of having industrial secrets related to defense and national security, all the way over to maintaining a technological edge and all the rest of it. So I'm not sure that anything new is going on other than the fact that we're seeing the war aspect, the kinetic aspect of war take front and center stage again. And for younger people, and even in my case, I haven't seen a mass conventional war, on European soil in my damn lifetime, where you've got, men now exceeding 1 million, probably getting up into 2 millions total. When you talk about territorial defense forces and logistics and rear area stuff, I never saw anything like that. So I think the reality is that the sneaky method of proceeding with globalization, using all these techniques from economical warfare and propaganda and the not the gay, but the these things have been proceeding apace, but now they're having to take a step back and ask themselves, how many legions does the rainbow T-shirt wearing Archbishop of Canterbury have? How many legions does the climate change czar have? Now we're getting down to where it's brass tacks, like they say, and that's where you necessarily have the division of the putative global entity into its constituent parts in this way.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that will come out of that hasn't been not trade competition as we normally know it, right? Where who can produce the best widget to do X, right? What I've noticed, and there's data to back this up, this is another part of my research, was that when economies tend to get complementary, where one side will, complement the other in regards to our relationship with China, for instance, right? Especially since our rhetoric with China has changed significantly from Obama's, 2011 pivot to Asia, where he was more focused about greater global integration. Because we have to remember what the rhetoric was like in foreign policy circles when Obama was in office. You had books all over in like the Barnes and Nobles and the other bookstores of the world, where you had questions like when China rules the world, or what America can do about the rising dragon. Your options were to, simply let them rise and be the ascendant economy, find a way to integrate with them, or to go and challenge their economic status. And so, again, his policy, as we saw, as the culmination of, at the time, was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a greater renewed interest in American freedom of navigation operations, a renewed interest in getting trade discussions to happen for greater integration. That kind of gave away as Trump kind of emerged out of nowhere with this swinging orange brick saying, like, no, like this globalization shit did not work out well for the American worker. And, the ghost of, the still living Pat Buchanan came to rise around. But one of the things that I was reading was from a Turkish professor. He wrote this article in, I want to say 2020. And he was talking about how when all these economies converge, especially complementary ones, because unlike the United States and the EU, where the relationship in terms of trade is rather competitive, the one between the United States and China, he argues, is complementary to one another, and it has been for the last 30 years. And what that often creates is a desire to act unilaterally to serve your own interests, because you start to realize as a policymaker and as a head of government and as a strategist or someone in a think tank that wants to write white papers like maybe like the 2016 white paper from the Rand Corporation that talked about how to undercut Chinese manufacturing. Those kind of things kind of come into your senses and your stream of consciousness if you're going to lead a state, that by relying on a complementary economy, you either have to keep up the status quo, which means not really doing anything to pursue your national interest, or you're going to have to take action. And that's what's driven American unilateral action in the last 6 years on everything ranging from Huawei, the issue of Taiwan, and trying to make sure that America is the leading force when it comes to, even global health crises, because that's another aspect that we saw out of this sort of decoupling of a global system is that, well, who was all pursuing the best interest for their own country? It wasn't the Indians or the Russians or the Chinese that were wanting to take American, vaccines. They wanted to take their own versions. In the same way that countries in South America, for instance, they were leveraged under Chinese and Russian vaccine diplomacy, for instance, and regarding the COOF, to take their version of it rather than to accept and open the Americans' ones. All these sort of formats of these global institutions, they are a very real reflection of where the world stage is going to be. No greater example has been the war in Ukraine. Every time the United States and her allies have gone up to provide United Nations General Assembly resolutions to condemn them, you're going to see some really interesting countries start showing up in the abstention area. Places like South Africa, places like India, places like Egypt that are going to vote in abstention. Yeah, those BRICS countries, those that are heavily reliant on, say, Russian military equipment, or those that can enjoy a relationship of cheap Russian natural gas and oil like India, or the fact that the United Nations World Food Program gets roughly 60 to 50% of all of their wheat and grain from two countries, which are, again, Russia and Ukraine. And so we're witnessing, I think, a really interesting dialogue where in the midst of two great geopolitical happenings, one being the coronavirus pandemic, and then the second one being the war in Ukraine, all of a sudden we're watching the reshifting and reshuffling of cards to maintain strategic hegemony, but at the same time recognize that things are going to be much more stratified in the future. Because one aspect about this war in Ukraine has been that America's relationship to India has gotten more tense, because India has received roughly 60% of all of its military imports from Russia since 2016. And we even got into a diplomatic tiff with them when they bought the S-300 and S-400 missile systems from them. But we also want them to be a part of this, Quad organization, the United States, Australia, South Korea, and India, to sort of be as this democratic bolster and military response to China. And so we're watching, for me, in my understanding of it all, that deglobalization is turning...
That's Japan, not South Korea.
Oh, Japan. Right? Thank you. Yeah,
right.
Thank you. But we're watching in this sort of talk of deglobalization, a much more stratified parts of the world being of interest, to where, the question of can we be everywhere at once in this globalized system is going to be, I think, put under major triage based on what are your immediate national security interests, which is why I think, for my prediction, and I may eat crow on this one, is that in the 2020s, I think that the American government is going to have a renewed emphasis on Central and South America, because the largest foreign direct investor in South America since 2000 has been China. And they're really interested in their rare earth mineral resources and their natural resources as well.
Oh, just natural resources in general. And look how, look at this interesting thing about Bolsonaro just saying, oh, yeah, I don't know how to say it in Portuguese, you know, Xinda. I don't know how to say shit, you know, but he's like, oh, hell, I'm going to head back to, you know, wow,
Well,
the United
I'm in Florida
States.
now at a Publix in Florida.
Right. Who would have thought he would come back to Biden US, right? But he did. And Lula just came into power, who seems to have a long, cozy relationship with countries like China and Russia. Yeah, and Russian investment in South America, though I'm sure it doesn't match China's at all, it's not insignificant either, as you must know. So yeah, I think I agree with you there. I don't think you're going to be eating crow on that, but if you if you do, come hang out with me. I know how to cook crow 100 different ways.
We'll get jackets, because I mean, one of the things that I noticed throughout the last 2 years is they got Uruguay, one of the few 13 nations and institutions that recognize Taiwan's independent sovereignty from China. They got them to flip on that. So there's one less country of a small minority of countries on Earth that recognize Taiwanese independent sovereignty. I think that's a huge kind of change in policy and position that the United States doesn't have, in the same way that...
Well, they got their nose to the wind down there, right? So they're like, I wonder who's going to come out ahead. It doesn't mean that it's one way or the other, but like you say, it does signal that those countries said, I wonder where our best bet is. And yeah, or the elites of them. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. To me, I just think that that's a pretty clear indication of where I think that the wind is going, that this talk of deglobalization is that we're going to try and put on our, we're going to pursue the parts that are good, so global health or things like that. But at the same time, we also have to focus looking inwardly on the local, what can we do about the nation? What can we do to strengthen our position here? And this doesn't just apply to, say, technology or natural resources. Again, the Paul Ehrlich, population bomb discourse has been back on Twitter. And, I was just saying in a voice convo with Morgoth last week, I said, well, really, there was a great book that came out in 2019 about it was called Empty Planet. And really, all of Paul Ehrlich's predictions were wrong. We're going to watch nations scramble for literally bodies in order to maintain their level of comfort or to maintain their economic position and status in the world. And that's going to cause competition as well. And that, I think, is going to come part with deglobalization, is that the West is on its path to quote unquote, replenishment migration. And whereas other countries are trying to pursue either natalist or strict localization policies. And that, I think, is also going to be a part of this conversation in the future. Because I don't think that this talk that we're having now is not, I don't think this will be like, say, a flash in the pan moment, like, say the Tigray War in Ethiopia. This convo is going to be here for decades, at least in the 2020s. This is the decade of deglobalization, stratified repositioning of the world stage, I think, for future conflict.
I agree. Yeah, certainly cannot argue there. But I would ask your opinion, since you've been looking into this recently and no doubt have done so for quite some time, since, again, you keep up with this. How do you see, what have you read about the idea of a Cold War II? And, what did you see there in terms of what people could envision with it? What are your own thoughts on that, if I may ask? And in particular, just in addition to generally, in particular about one aspect, not to the exclusion of the others. I want to hear, whatever you have on it. I'd be very interested to hear. But also in the sense that now with the three players, you've got India's a little bit behind, countries like Brazil and the rest, right? But China, Russia, the U.S., maybe the EU could be conceived of as a thing in some respects at this point, but man, that also may have gone the way of the dodo. We'll see. But in particular, where you've got the United States, Russia, and China as three entities, but you've got this odd dynamic where Russia and China are they've been jammed together, a la Heartland strategy, right? So you don't have a single hegemon in that domain. However, because of pressure right now that's pushed the two of them together necessarily, China's perfectly happy to buy energy. It makes them less susceptible to problems if they wanted to move their navy, a blue water navy, out past the first and past the second island chain, right? They don't have to worry as much about energy interdiction in a situation where the United States is putting pressure on them, at least seemingly, right, over things like Taiwan and COVID. And we could even see things like reparations in the future. Don't rule it out, right? COVID reparations. Anyway, whatever. And then Russia over on the other side, having to face this conflict with the West, which means it needs these markets to sell to, like India and China. It can buy, lots of old 152 or 155, I can't remember which, artillery shells, millimeter artillery shells. Basically, Russia and China are being pushed together. So you've got a tripartite system. As you pointed out, China needs to kind of stay synchronized with the US in some respects, and we need it too. And yet at the same time, it seems like we're having trouble with China. But we've driven China into the arms of Russia and driven Russia into the arms of China, and paradoxically made it in Russia's interests as well as in China's to work something out with India and peel India off from its alliances with us vis-a-vis China. Now, I'm not saying it's going to get there, because India, as you well know, has serious issues with China and you can't get around them. But so does Russia. And we're pushing, to some extent, these groups together at the same time, where we seem to be laying down some kind of new Cold War, except it's not with just, the sort of Warsaw Pact and Soviet, arrangement and their affiliated countries and the Free West on the other side. Now it's almost like three, but the dynamics are weird. So I didn't get that out right, because I'm still just spinning my wheels about it. But what do you think about these things? On the one hand, the idea of the Cold War II in general, and in particular on the oddness with it not being bipolar. It's, three-ish elements, maybe four.
I think that Russia will pay a price for its relationship to China, in part because I do think a significant amount of its capital and resources, of course, are being spent towards this war. And I think to a large extent, the Western intelligentsia knows that. But at the same time, I think that it's also a concern that we have decided to, simultaneously, with this Nancy Pelosi trip, we really decided to throw up the Taipei Agreement of 1972. And we really just started to throw out, 50 years of diplomatic history that we've had on our position with Taiwan, although we've kind of always played fast and loose with that. But at the same time, we're kind of as Kissinger is, turns 100 this year, I think, it's interesting to watch his world order that he built kind of go down the way that it has in regards to Russia's and China's relationship. But I think what we'll see, and what I've been reading, and again, I do read what these guys put out, because I think that when they talk what they say that they're going to do, you should probably read what they say that they're going to do. It's just, it's prudent advice, in the same way that when the American government, for instance, when the American government stopped printing out their arms sales towards the end of last year in 2022, it makes you think, that's a bit concerning, and you don't know where things might go.
It's at a minimum, it's at a minimum, you're going to get to hear what the inner party is telling the outer party flunkies, right?
Yeah.
So they know where to move their investments, right?
Yeah, but for instance, right, that CIA ghoul Ian Bremer, one of the articles I was reading from him is that he says, thus the overall trajectory of the relations between the world's two most important economies long term is directly headed towards confrontation. It's going to be very hard to steer those ships in another direction, particularly at a time of less functional international architecture, which I always have to chuckle at the words international architecture, because international law isn't a thing. There is no global sovereign that will determine what country gets
total
what.
Fiction.
It is international law is a total fiction, because international law is enforced by who's got the biggest stick. And in a lot of ways, that's why I always use the UN General Assembly as a really great way to map where the sticks are being pointed and what sides of the developing world are getting jabbed into, because you can tell where the money and influence is going. And so when, the CIA, one of the biggest heads of the CIA and one of these largest important parts of a Western intelligentsia says, even when coronavirus ends, because this was written in early 2021, it doesn't mean that we're not going to watch them scramble for developing markets and economies to sort of stratify their own positions against one another. I think that we are going to see some form. They'll say Cold War II, and it kind of makes me chuckle because Thomas 777 makes a point that the American government's really good at fighting the Cold War. So their hammer is the Cold War. They see every nail as the thing that they need to hammer down and make a Cold War out of it. I kind of agree. I kind of agree with that logic because we are positioning ourselves, or I don't want to say the U.S. government, the USG, that's the term I just like to use for its technicality aspect. What the USG is attempting to do is position itself as a way to take advantage of the situation. Because what did the war in Ukraine do, for instance? Well, there are two companies in Ukraine that produce roughly 60 to 50% of all of the world's semiconductor-grade neon that you need for manufacturing. Lo and behold, in regards to rare earth minerals and rare earth mineral and element production that you need for semiconductors, conveniently fits in with our other ongoing issues on the other side of the world, vis-a-vis China and Taiwan. The Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company passed the USA CHIPS Act will make it really hard for for Chinese, companies to work with us. And the Americans, they either have to work with us or they have to forfeit, getting special licenses and privileges and face tariffs or to face fines and things like that and additional scrutiny to not do business with the American government. That's a pretty hefty thing because you want to do business with one of the world's largest military expenditures on the planet. And so I think that we are going to see something posed in that kind of rhetoric as a Cold War. Although how well that can work, I don't know, because as America under this current political formula is this sort of happy-go-lucky anti-woke sort of, or this anti-racist position where, you and I are the only real enemies in this nation. Not, we saw how they reacted when Trump called it like the Wuhan plague or the Chinese virus, right? And so it makes me think, well, a big part of the Cold War was sort of having a rightful, non-Anglo sort of ethnic enmity to have in regards to it. That's a side thought. That's something that I always keep in the back of my head because that narratively is important. We, in 20 years, we went from calling people, individuals that sleep with camels or towel heads or whatever to, now we can't do
so that. Damn insane.
Yeah, right. And so now we can't do that 20 years later. But that's a side thing. I don't know how well the relationship with India and China will, it's always going to be tense. I mean, they have a treaty, right, where they don't have firearms at a certain part of their border. So we saw a few weeks ago them just hitting each other with sticks and bats and boards.
Did that happen again, or it was a couple of years ago?
It happened a few weeks ago.
Again?
Yeah,
like people get knocked into the rivers and beaten up with bats with nails in them. Like they're going Negan on each other, on the roof of the world.
Because their idea of a border security agreement is, okay, guys, we'll have an all-out melee, but no guns.
Well, in some respects, that is based. And
I kind of have to respect it to some degree, but
for style. But the Romans would laugh and crush all of them, right? But look at the thing that you got with you brought up with Thomas 777. I don't want to cut you off. I just want to throw it back in again. That's very much the idea of a dialectic. It's very much that binary thinking. You're with us or you're against us, or like the games that AA will play when he puts up. He's learning about democracy, right, and forking decision paths, right. The Greek letter upsilon, which is like a Y, right? The forking path, the moment of decision. But then you throw in 3. So for now, it's easy for us to all say, like I said something on Twitter and some shill bot freak show account showed up and said something like, because I was sharing my disgust for Kevin McCarthy showing up with a little folded Ukraine flag in his pocket. And someone came in and responded, do you support the communist Putin? So it's almost like they're hoping that in the West it will be sufficient to just sort of say they're all communists, at least in the United States, where they can get, for example, a bunch of people from Texas or Appalachia to go die for them, right? Just call them all communists. And so in that respect, it seems from one side that they're trying to construe it as black and white. But China and Russia, so long as we push them together, then we can construe it as binary, which is fundamentally like a communist dialectic, the same game, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But paradoxically, as long as we push the two of them together to gain that rhetorical advantage, we're actually making the opponent stronger. So again, the 2 versus 3 system of the Cold War. Have you come across anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, what I've noticed and what I've read and what I've observed has been this bizarre form of it's almost like we're repeating, David Fromm's axis of evil again. We've got Russia, China, and usually it's Iran for obvious, lobby reasons. But
haven't heard much about North Korea lately, though, have we?
No,
they're busy selling artillery shells. Yeah.
The last thing I saw Western media report on North Korea was that Kim Jong-un showed off his 16-year-old daughter at one of the missile tests, and that was about it. So, but we have that sort of, even despite all the things that are happening in Russia and Ukraine with regards to who's who and what ideology are they actually. It's almost as if we are really just repeating what Paul Gottfried wrote in his book, Anti-Fascism, A Global Crusade, is that, 1945, the end of it, is year zero for the rules-based order. And what do we get out of that? Well, we get things like never again. We can't make sure that 1933 ever happens. We can't have everything that we just endured ever happen again. That's the whole bit about it. And in turn, so what do? Well, we've gone on this sort of global crusade. We call things fascist. I've heard Putin be called a fascist. I've heard Xi Jinping be referred to as not communist China sometimes, but like or Chinese fascism and things like that. And so the U.S., it's funny because the French Jacques Derrida had said that really the Western liberal mind has the specter of Marx that haunts it. Well, really, America, especially more than anybody, is haunted by the specter of a 1945 Austrian painter above all else. But I think that the thing about where this new Cold War, or any sort of rhetoric about deglobalization, is that our foot is on the technological accelerator, where we are fighting about vital technologies that are going to be the future of things. This is why you see concerns over cybersecurity. How do we defend vital infrastructure that could be hacked? Not to mention, we saw this in the last 3 administrations about, the Office of Personnel Management being hacked, where vital government interests and had their data leaked and things like that. In the same way that we've seen ransomware attacks, either by foreign operative governments or just by random hackers and pirates. It really makes you wonder in a lot of ways where we're going, because the accelerator we're not taking our foot off of it. Even if we did, it's stuck down there, because we're going after things like quantum computing, hypersonic missiles. We're entering that level of speed that could potentially get us the kind of accident that Paul Virilio warned about. And I think that that's a direction that we're heading towards that's pretty damn concerning.
Yeah, I would agree. So my takeaway, my understanding, of what you said, and I think it makes sense, at least this aspect of it. I'm referring to here is they're just going to try to collapse the categories and just gloss it as fascism, and that seems to be working for the moment. There are certainly some cracks at the edges. The whole damn scarecrow is starting to fray. Oh, I wish they had these chicken McNuggets outside of Auschwitz 75 years ago. They're such delicious things, these chicken nuggets. There are aspects in which the story is becoming a little bit threadbare, right? But at the same time, I share your concern as regards what you called the acceleration, because I've thought about it. I'm sure you have too. All these Warsaw Pact legacy arsenals, right? They're getting emptied, And, it's kind of like separating your shit for the garbage man, the Bradleys that they're fixing to send, 50 of them or whatever, right? For now that we know of. And the German tanks that are going to be sent, they get blown up right proper, and heavy equipment's got to come and recycle them. They go in the one with the tin cans, right? And as a consequence, all of these countries that have recently come aboard with the European Union, or else explicitly with NATO, sometimes both, of course, all this old legacy gear is being dumped. We in the United States, and certainly in Europe as well, in the same way and in some other ways, for example, energy prices, they're paying for it. So they're getting rid of all of the old equipment, and we're paying for what's necessary to send that to Ukraine to be scrapped, right? In a thick pink mist, but it's essentially just a scrapping operation. We're also paying to replace it. And I know you're aware of this too, because we've talked about it. It's a situation now where they're going to point to the lessons of the Ukraine and say, oh, look at all the different gear we had, the lack of a standard. We've got to get a standard imposed here so we can, streamline training and manufacturing, ammunition standards, and all the rest. We've gone a long way with NATO, but, a lot of these countries didn't have the budget, and they kind of, were lagging behind with it. So now we've all got to get together and replace this stuff in such a fashion that we can field in continental Europe an army sufficient to deal with the threat that we have. Now, we've talked in Prometheanism, or on the Prometheanism stream. Again, we'll take it up again, I'm sure, about how the jury's still out on whether or not, for example, France and Germany are going to be able to get together and form a European army, or whether that ship has entirely sailed and the Three Seas Initiative, Eastern Europeans, with nationalism encouraged by the gay, become the tip of the spear for European defense. Territorially, geographically, they're there for that. I just haven't done the necessary work to really look at the size of the militaries in countries like, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, less so, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and others, Romania. But we have our foot on the accelerator. I guess what I'm getting at is that once all this old Warsaw gear is sold off, and under this impetus further west, they're rearming like crazy. This is a massive, it seems like we're going to see a massive reindustrialization, because in the West, they're going to have to get their shit together to provide artillery shells and ammunition, and to repair tanks, and, produce cruise missiles and drones. And, the Warsaw gear is getting sold off now. This coming year, come March or whatever, we're going to get to see what rolls in. And with everything that rolls into Ukraine to be scrapped, again, in a pink mist, so sorry. It's just what the dialectical process of history requires as it advances itself towards progress. Further west, all of these countries are going to have to really begin to fork up some money, certainly the ones that have emptied their existing legacy arsenals, to buy new gear. And at this point, it's certainly within the realm of possibility that that we're going to see a lot of these countries have to throw down real money and then use the shit they buy. If they don't kick sand backwards in the cat box somehow in Ukraine, that could easily spread.
Yeah.
So yeah, to me, I bring that up because under the general rubric of deglobalization, again, what that invokes is the need, if not nations, then at least distinct zones, the need for at least distinct zones where you can have some sort of territorial allegiance, so that you can hire the people you need to hire who work out trajectories for rockets and do all kinds of pointy-headed math, right? And who can keep secrets about what new equipment's going to be created so that you can maintain the secrecy regarding your weapons program and the technological edge. Yeah, we could definitely see this turn into one of those situations where you pull down a blind alley and then find out you don't have any space to turn your car around.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned about shortages. I mean, Germany has probably been hit the hardest in regards to the German military facing a severe arms shortages and does not have enough ammunition in case, it would only hold out the Bundeswehr for only 1 to 2 days of warfare, according to, De Welt. And, German Defense Minister Christine Lambrecht has been facing nothing but criticism from the German parliament over that issue. Is that, well, why is that the case? And I mean, this is I think it's a long-standing structural issue that, for instance, Germany has faced. And it does also kind of throw things in the face about the renewed debate over European defense autonomy. Because, in times of global shocks, I find, again, it's cyclical. Like we were talking about when you mentioned the Google Ngram about this term. Every time that it seems to pop up, it's in the midst of some kind of economic shock or in the midst and aftermath of some international event that the American government kind of got involved in, whether that be the Gulf War, whether it be the end of the Cold War, the dot-com bubble, 2008, the Euro crisis, and the coming recession now, and especially now with this war in regards to the pandemic economic impact. And I think to myself that I don't think you're going to see that European defense autonomy come back, because even if they wanted it, and I know France does, because the French government has wanted to increase its spending on its own military investitures mainly for sub-Saharan African reasons, because also there's some Russian and Chinese interest there as well. But you're not going to get it, because we also just pretty much told them when Nord Stream 2 went that they have to get in line or else. And so, but the thing that I do see coming out of this conversation of, well, we should focus on the good, right? Well, we should focus on, global health information sharing. We should focus on making it easier to have an internet of bodies, so it'd be easier to track and maintain security and data for everybody. Whereas the dirty, ugly side of that they won't talk about except as a way to, literally what the Council of Foreign Relations said back in June, to cope with it, was the things focusing on securitization, increased state involvement in manufacturing and the production of electronic equipment and energy. That way they can focus on national security and getting the real things that need to be done, which is securing, maintaining, and expanding hegemony where possible and necessary. And that's a big reason as to why I fall in sort of the realist school of international relations, is that tends to be the case throughout history, is that once you can secure yourself a little bit of economic sustainability, then it's all about maintaining your sovereignty, and then after that, hegemony. And that's what we're really beginning to see here, is this, well, where can that be flexed and where can that be challenged? And this decade for sure, I think, is going to see a sort of a withdrawal, but like you had said, sort of this renewed rearmament, because, the French are giving the Ukrainians, they're giving them, I think, the AMX wheeled, light tank vehicle that they wanted to get rid of. And it's like the same thing when it came to 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. What did the Russians and the Chinese and the rest of the world do? They sat back and they watched the Americans fight a war, an asymmetrical war against an insurgency, and they kind of learned their lessons from it. And so in the same way here, what is the rest of the world doing right now? Well, I guarantee you that nations that have independent military, industrial complexes that aren't buying Soviet or Chinese or American export models, they're looking at this war right now and wondering, well, what works and what doesn't? And so, it's that old saying that we learn to perfect the old war just in time for the new one.
Yeah. Do you imagine that at this point, given what they're seeing, and doubtless the money that they must be beginning to make, a country like Sweden is going to try to turn loose of its significant, for the size of that country, domestic arms production capacity? Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I doubt that. What was the other thing I wanted to ask about? Yeah, what do you make of this? I mean, we still do have a bit of time, presumably.
Yeah, we got a little bit.
Okay. So what do you make of this? Another aspect of this that I'm trying to get my head around is the idea of how we've got an odd sort of distributed war, right? So at this point, yeah, I'm sure that top brass in the United States and military trainers, and of course some elite units that get dispatched to places like Romania to be available on the border, right? Like the U.S. military feels what's happening now, right? But I don't see it as being anything that hurts it, right? The U.S. military animal, leaving aside things like Drag Queen Story Hour, right, which continue to make inroads there. Right now, I don't see what's happening in Ukraine weakening it at all. They get to see how Russian weapons work. They get to see how their weapons work. It's like everybody gets to have a party and see how it works out. The last big event like this, where everybody got to like see what the state of modern war is, to me, really was the Iraq War, right? Which is why you saw, if you were recently doing stuff with, or maybe it was the Gulf War. Yeah, I think it was probably it was the Gulf War for unrestricted warfare, right? The Chinese military theorists came in and said, holy hell, man, they just came in and just cluster bombs, precision munitions. They just tore a new
They were dropping
asshole.
gold.
Right, but they could afford they could afford to, and yeah, for every bit they dropped, an equal amount went into somebody's pockets, and it wasn't you or me. That was the last time that we had something kind of like Ukraine, where everybody can look and say, wow, I wonder how these weapons will work. And I wonder how we're going to have to change military doctrine based on the emerging realities on the battlefield, right? So anyway, the United States, yeah, we're getting screwed economically. We're paying for a lot of this. But it's a good thing for the military of the gay, or the USG, let's just say, right? And it's good things for weapons manufacturers, right? So we're taking a significant but not fatal economic hit in the United States because of this. It's what I mean when I brought up this whole thing about a distributed war, right? So the U.S. is paying for a lot of it, but we're reaping the rewards, as we always try to do with weapons manufacturing and extension of our influence. In Europe itself, Western European nations are certainly paying for this. They're sending arms and weapons, of various kinds, and they're having to eat the energy issues that are being created here, and to suffer, particularly in the case of Germany, the follow-on effects of having been cut off from reliable deliveries of inexpensive energy from Russia. So they're paying. So you've got the United States, probably other countries, Canada too. I'm not, familiar with the details. European Union countries certainly are paying for this. And then the actual people fighting are Ukrainians, and then all kinds of foreign volunteers, right? So you've got a financial powerhouse in the West that's distributing, and this is what I mean by distributed, the cost of paying for it. And then you've got, little gimmies that get thrown out to the big military manufacturers. Oh, it's really expensive, but you and your buddies, you're going to make some good money. You're going to make some good money. We need some, howitzers, and we need some whatchamacallits with all kinds of, tracked vehicles and, mortars and drones. And then in Eastern Europe, it's people who are paying with their lives, primarily Ukrainians and Russians. We may see Belarusians dragged into the mess. And there's certainly I don't even know how many Poles are involved, but I have to imagine that it's probably a significant number, right? And then, of course, on the Russian side, maybe they're bringing Syrians. They're definitely bringing in Chechens and Bashkir and people from all over the joint, right? A distributed war like this is a strange thing, because in one country, they're being economically destroyed and the people are dying. But as long as they can show Usyk and Lomachenko victorious, in the boxing ring, that's going to be enough for them. They're just Slavs anyway, right? So to speak, under this model of how people might think about this. Europeans, well, you know what? It stifles their desire to form a military of their own, makes them more dependent on NATO, and reduces the power of Germany. How long has it been since we all imagined that Germany is the most important country in the EU? Yeah, they probably still are. But look at how they're being hammered and just smashed and hammered and smashed. You've got a distributed cost for the war, and its follow-on effects are in many ways serving the powers that be in the U.S. So, what do you make of that, and what it might mean for globalism?
Yeah, that's been the interesting part about all of this is watching, and I mean, it's a much shorter supply chain to move things from, say, America to Europe to near the front line where they can drop things off from Poland to live, right, or Lvov, or however you wish to pronounce it. I find that to be interesting, right? But at the same time, it's the same issue that we've watched since 2020. Because I mean, what happened during 2020 in America and in other places, I'd imagine, well, especially in America, was like, oh, everyone's buying guns, and then there's this convenient ammunition shortage, and then lo and behold, all this stuff starts to pour out in the way it does. But I find it to be interesting because it really is just a showing off of toys and whatnot. But as for what it means for globalism, I mean, Germany still wields significant importance, and we need to pay attention to Germany in this year, especially with regards to its economy, because it is still one of the heaviest export economies in regards of manufacturing in all of Western Europe. I mean, it's half their economy, last I checked from the figures. And so the fact that we're kind of hammering them with these costs, and then, oh, by the way, they can't meet their military obligations either to send stuff over, let alone defend themselves. Although I don't ever see us having another land war in Germany anytime soon. But still, it says a lot that the Bundeswehr is, oh my God.
I hope not, man.
I hope not, right? I don't think the world would like in the course of 150 years, less than 100 years that we've had 3, land wars in Europe over Germany, but neither here nor there. I'm just really curious as to what, because this is the thing, when I hear these people talk about globalization and globalism and their concerns about it, they're putting on this show that says, oh, like, globalism is remarkably resilient, and this deglobalization is going to be focused on things like geoeconomics, where our real concerns about globalism are the same concerns that we've had for like the last 6 to 10 years, which are things like nationalism and populism, or skepticism now towards the biomedical industry, which I don't think we're ever going to see that trust ever regained. But that's the rhetoric I see out of these publications and from these governments and from these spokespeople and think tanks. I'm thinking to myself, what am I missing here where these guys are still concerned about like populism, especially here in America? Like tonight's January 6th. I'm like, you guys killed it. I don't know what happened. So I don't know. That's the thing. I think that globalism in regards to like the Western Davos crowd, they're still partying like it's 2099 and they've won, and that we're still seeing op-eds about why it's good to screw short men, so you have shorter children because that's good for the fucking environment. Marry and screw your manlets, people. Apparently, that's real ESG, and so I think that the political globalism that people like ourselves or Morgoth have been talking about in grave concern, that's here to stay. But I think that it's going to be more inwardly focused, as it has been since the great concerns post-Trump. But I don't think those parts are going to see too many immediate challenges, because the mechanisms for that still exists pretty much where it needs to be, which is in Western continental Europe, the UK, and the United States, and Japan, and South Korea, the parts that are kind of already integrated into this mess.
Yeah, in places like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, where you're just like, what the fuck? You know, you just what? Sorry, this is a more highbrow show. I'm sorry, people, but yeah, you look at countries like that, and you're like, what are you? Yeah. So yeah, I agree with you that they will turn inward, which means if they're no longer concerned for a time with having to dominate these areas that have managed to escape their control, they're going to turn inwards, you know, and we're seeing it with, you know, every aspect of, you know, all the classic surveillance state stuff, the medical data gathering. Yeah. Do you hear about the business of breathalyzers on vehicles?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
And
did.
they'll need to be networked. And if they're able to read what's in an exhalation, it's just a matter of switching a few things out to be able to read other things in an exhalation. And they'll at least get you to having to get you used to the idea of having to do a medical scan at intervals daily in order to maintain your privileges with equipment. So yeah, to your point about turning inwards, all signs indicate it's coming. But I do think there's something to the idea of a Cold War, in the sense that we are going to push these other powers, for the time being, Russia and China, into each other's arms. We'll see what happens with India. We certainly have not seen an increase in stability and cooperation between India and the U.S. since Trump, and with the initiation of all this trouble elsewhere. You know, we're gonna see these groups form. For now, it looks like two. We'll probably call them all fascists. But it's gonna. I think it's gonna lock down a bit. I think I would have a very different time now if I tried to fly to Moscow, as I did some years back. And I grew up with that world of the Cold War. Now, I was only seeing the very end of it when I began to travel. But the first time I went to Europe, there was still East Germany. And very, very few people were going to Russia. So I remember I remember the time in the mid 90s when my friend got to travel the old Silk Road through Central Asia. And it was an enormous opportunity because no one had been able to do that before.
Yeah.
So, you know, those of us who are older are maybe we're going to see some return of a division. You know, we'll see. One of the big things that I would want to look at in the future is where there are opportunities to drive a wedge between Russia and China. And that would be something actually I'd love to see you do a stream on, just because, again, you follow the policy and you follow the wonks and you keep up with the white papers and things.
I think so. I've started to do an inkling of this, and Christopher Sandbach actually pointed me in an interesting direction, which was maritime insurance documentation, because the Chinese had recently been sort of rejecting some Russian shipping in their own reinsurance papers that were coming out of Russia, not other places. And I wonder how much that has to do with American pressure, and that's an area that I'm investigating. But I would have never thought to look at that kind of aspect of, you know, cargo reinsurance documentation. But, you know, it could be an avenue of this unrestricted economic warfare that we're seeing. So I'll probably...
And it allows them to jump in and cut trade wherever they want to, the same way the Brits did in the 1830s, based on various justifications. Sorry.
Oh, no, yeah. So I just certainly do think that that's a one aspect. I think that there'll be more. But the thing about deglobalization, in regards to what we've talked about tonight, this sort of nationalization, this focus on the world, this focus on the nation, is that I just think that what we're going to see is that geopolitical interests, like, you know, where power competition plays out, you know, it's not going to be like it's 2004 and America can still put its fingers in a lot of different pots at the same time. I think you're going to see a much more stratified area of influence in a lot of places. And as we saw from Secretary Blinken last month, that it cannot simultaneously supply to allies at once, Ukraine and Taiwan. You don't admit that. You don't.
He said that publicly?
Yeah, he said that publicly.
Wow.
And you don't say that shit out loud. That's the shit. Yeah, you don't say that shit in front of the hose, as they say. And so, he with that being said, it's like, okay, so we're going to see a much more stratified, turn inward economy, and I think that there's a big portion of what you said, and Geo, who was in the chat earlier, the term they call
Vatnik.
he calls it, they call it gladio nationalism, of trying to find an enemy to prop up to convince us, corn-fed guys from the middle of the country to go out and die for the USG, whereas because recruitment rates are down low. There's even debate. I saw an article in Foreign Affairs magazine last month that was like, we should talk about, the parameters and rubrics of an all-volunteer military service. And I'm like, there's no way in hell you fuckers are thinking about redoing the draft. But, who knows? Who knows? All bets are off in this day and age. So,
hey, you tie it to citizenship. They've done it before. There
sure
have been periods when South Vietnamese and Filipinos and Nicaraguans all came in large numbers to the U.S. because they signed up.
Hey, and look at all those millions of people that have just poured in over the last couple of years. That's a scary thought to think about.
I don't know. I don't know
either. But I do think that we're going to see.
I'm going to keep an open mind.
That's true. We should. But I do think that the geopolitical picture will be much more stratified and it will be sectionalized, where I think because of how costly things are, especially as we head towards a recession. Even Christine Lagarde of the ECB, the European Central Bank, has said, we are heading into a recession this year. They use the word recession, so things are getting a little dire for them to start telling the truth. So I think that means that you're gonna have to pinch your pennies where you can as a nation. So I'd imagine more austerity. That also means your foreign policy is going to be more focused on how can I squeeze blood from a stone that I've been squeezing for like 30 years. And that's going to be the real interesting thing to come there. But I think that's a good place to pin the conversation for the night, lest you had any final thoughts.
No, just happy to discuss this with you. I don't know where it's going to go, but there's some interesting shit going on.
Oh,
and
yes.
And all of us should be paying close attention to it. I mean, even if you just assumed that you were just going to focus on the aspect here of a bunch of military observers coming and watching the current biggest war, right? It like makes me think of Brits coming to watch what's going on in the United States in the 1860s, right? Or military observers from continental Europe going to check out what's going on with the Boer War or with the Russo-Japanese War, right? Just from that perspective alone, what's going on in Ukraine should have us all looking closely. And that's just the sort of flashpoint that seems to be driving this latest bit of deglobalization, which, as I said at the outset, I will assert again, seems to me like a term used by the inner party to talk to the outer party about why they're not going to get as much in their 401k or equivalent. Whatever their ill-gotten gains kitty is, whatever their ill-gotten gains cookie jar is, the ones who have signed up to be a part of this program, who want to get their piece of the rock going forward, and who now have to face the fact that, wow, despite what I thought about how progress was going to progress, it appears that for some reason things aren't working out so well economically. I think that's the point at which people run in and say deglobalization. So yeah, anyway, that's my way of saying something.
Yeah, when you say it like that, deglobalization sounds like a great word for austerity. It's not as painful or remindful of what 2009 and 10 and 11 looked and felt like. It's a sexy word for right wingers. Oh, deglobalization's great. Oh, you're for austerity. You far right bastards. Like, it's just, hey, it's a great rhetorical framing tool.
And think about, last piece. Remember, I looked to try to find an antonym for deglobalization, and it appeared to be nationalization. But as I pointed out at the outset, it would be very easy for this thing to resolve itself simply into two blocks.
Yeah.
At which point you could see things still being united under heaven, but again, under the Cold War model, which, as you pointed out, Thomas 7.7 is recognized, serves everybody well, because rather than having to have this cat herding exercise in figuring out who gets allowed into the last final halls of power for this thing that's controlled from one place. Instead, you can just split it out. It's very easy for everybody to rationalize it. They could say, wow, deglobalization is basically another way of saying that I get to at least have something, even though now what I'm doing is fighting over half of the pie instead of all of the pie. Ooh, I could fight for all of the pie, but not even be able to get into the fight. Or we could split it in terms of how the elites reckon this, right? The elite calculus. They could say, oh, well, if it's uniting all under heaven and I don't get a piece of shit. But if we split it into two sections, maybe I'll get a piece of something. And that doesn't mean that Ukraine, woof, 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 is going to continue as a nationalist project necessarily, or Latvia, or any other country that has nationalist aspirations that thinks that they have to fight the Russian. Very unlikely that any of these countries that imagine that deglobalization will lead to nationalization, it's very unlikely any of them are correct. I think it's just going to form into two blocks. And I agree with you, as you said earlier, we're going to turn inwards. And what we haven't been able to apply to those in the other zone to better control and manage them, we're going to apply to our own populations. And it's a small consolation, but the good news is that in Russia over there, they're going to be fucking their own populations also. Sorry, that wasn't good French. But the point is that I think it's going to be ugly for all of us. And nationalization or a return of nationalism is the least likely outcome.
Well, my brain just thinks of old style labor nationalizing things in the 1970s in the UK. And what an interesting way, in the name of national security, for Democrats to nationalize things, right? It's like poetry. It rhymes.
But that's governments that do not have the interest of their citizens at heart taking control of industry and calling it nationalization.
Oh, just like our government, doesn't it?
Indeed. So we can call it whatever we want. What do you want to call it, Maury? If you want to call it nationalization, I'll call it nationalization. For fuck's sake, let's just make some money here. Sorry.
Oh,
and it's not all of them. It's a bunch of wasps who run the military-industrial complex, just to be fair. But yeah,
that's true. But so I'm going to get us towards announcements and Frog of the Week, and then we will have our proper promotions. I don't like to use the word shilling, but we'll have some proper promotions and such there. So I'm going to share my screen and make sure that it shares the system audio tab this time. That way we can get the lovely music to go on, and we'll start the slideshow. Let's see here. Cool. If it'll load in due time and in due season, and if not, I will just work off of my notes here. But if not, you know what? Hold on a second. I'll let it stop for a minute there, and we'll let it load. If it'll load at all. But you know what? That's okay. I will just read off my notes here instead on another tab because I have it open. So, as for announcements, ladies and gentlemen, do not fear. We will have them up in just a second. Unless my internet dies on me, then I'm really screwed. But okay, it doesn't want to load. That's really unfortunate. But well, I guess we'll get the shilling out of the way.
I cannot miss Frog of the Week.
It'll appear. It will appear. Do not worry. I will get it up. But it will load. It is a crisis because the audience loves Frog of the Week. The viewership goes up every time I do Frog of the Week, which is ridiculous to think about. But everyone's here for the frog.
If I could do a high pitch re, I would do a John D high pitch re.
Right
now for the frog.
Mr. D is in chat, so spiritually he can do it for us. If it will just bloody load, that is so frustrating. But with that being said, Oliver, is there anything that you were working on that you would like to promote or let people know what you're doing?
I'm working on adulthood. I'm way too old to still be working on adulthood and responsibility. That's my main project at the moment. I can't ask for any support in that. Otherwise, but enough about me. What do you think about me? Let me look at my calendar. The only stream that I have coming up that that looks like it's going to be a good one is one that will be with Marcus Furious Pertinax, Chris Gard, Lady of Shalott, and possibly others. We will see. And it will be on Australia and the situation in Ausland. And that's coming up on Wednesday, the 11th at 5 p.m. Eastern. Otherwise, nothing immediately to shell other than Whom Would You Hammer? The series on Twitter.
God.
I am absolutely fighting against AA with his ridiculous Groundhog Day Jennifer Connelly show. Go to Twitter and follow Whom Would You Hammer rather than Who Would You Do. I'm sorry, Prude. I just ruined your show.
I love how it's Twitter has just devolved into a competition of horny posting and who can do it better. But I think at the end of the day, Marcus wins above both of you.
I'm not going to say anything about my friend until after he appears on the upcoming show. Then I will talk him endlessly.
Okay, well, I'm going to load it up without pulling the... it won't do the music this time, guys. I apologize. But for some reason, anytime I try and make it go full screen, it does not want to cooperate with me. So I will just put up our wonderful notes here. I will always recommend that you guys subscribe to the Old Glory Club. We just had a great discussion on the narrative and the events that played out on January 6th, 2021.
Didn't you just have one tonight?
Yeah, we did earlier today. Charlemagne, Raging Mandrill, and Not Me, Not You talked about what happened that day on the Capitol, the narratives, and the history related to coup d'etat attempts in the past, and why God really doesn't like it when you play pretend when it comes to this issue. But as we mentioned at the very beginning of the stream, keep your eyes out on Semiogogue's channel when we talk about Prometheanism, the 3 Seas initiative in Poland. We just had our good friend Jimmy Thomas give us some really good data and points and information on Twitter that we're going to have to dive through and take a look at. And if you missed Millennial this year, all of the videos and MP3s are available. Oliver's got his wonderful appearance on the community tab on his channel. I also have it on mine on the community tab, so by all means, give it a watch, because I know that Woes likes to do polling and look at the view count and see who did well every year.
There could be only one.
We like to be there at the top, 10. So by all means, do watch. This month, we are kicking off Patron Book Club once more. On January 28th, a Saturday at noon Eastern. It's meant not Eastern, Eastern. We will be reviewing Oswald Spengler's Man and Technics. You can get it free via PDF online if you don't have a copy already. But, for just $2 a month, you can get access to it and a great conversation. And we'll be doing it, and we'll record it with our patrons so you guys can keep it if you miss out. And then there'll be an patron-exclusive Substack next week. I always try and put out some patron-exclusive articles every other week on the Substack, so stuff for you guys. This week's episode of the Digital Archipelago, I normally do this on Saturday, but next week it'll be on my channel. We'll be having a conversation on technology, Luddites, and things like that. It'll be a good time. And then I will have a brand new video, fresh new video scripted for you guys on January 18th in 2 weeks. So it'll be a really good time for all of you guys again. So I'm just going to move through, and sadly I don't have the music up for you guys, but this is a brand new frog, and you can tell by the name it's kind of cringe, but discovered last year in 2022, endemic to Ecuador. It was, part of the, it's a genus that has been resurrected and reformed in 2005, Hyloskirtus, after they revised the, family of Hylidae frogs, common subtropical tree frogs. But this one is discovered in Ecuador, and it prefers warmer wetland climates. It will stick to pools and ponds and running streams during the rainy season. It will mate usually early in the spring, starting towards the end of March to the end of May. And then, of course, they spawn roughly about 36 hours for the fertilization part to take place and for the eggs to start beginning to hatch, with black and orange covering with horizontal islets. So this is actually one of the few brand new frog species this year. But unfortunately, it has a terrible last name for its Latin aspect because it's named after the writer and actor Seth MacFarlane, and it's honorifics because just pay enough money to an environmental NGO, they'll name an animal after you. So Mr. D needs to use his patronage to buy off somebody so he can name a frog Apustachio or something. But that's this week's Frog of the Week. He's this cute little orange fellow with a terrible name. we'll have to change that. We'll name him appropriately one of these days. But last but not least, I do want to thank our wonderful patrons, especially those who donate $20 or more a month on Subscribestar. This includes Fearless Leader, Raging Mandrill, User 4A, 5B, 5D, B5, Cowering Bugman, Winston Fujimori, Preservatism, Focron, Consumer, Hunger, and Mr. Voluble Ox, who I also have to thank for his lovely Christmas time tip. I did not get a chance to answer him on Subscribestar, but I wanted to say thank you. It was very kind. And you guys make it happen. And to now, we can catch up with Super Chats, because there were a couple that came in. I know that it is usually late today, but I'm thankful for all of the viewers that stuck around. And Mr. Luthemplar, the artist formerly known as Cringewalker, says, I do somewhat think Moore's law is slowing/ending the ability to innovate further, pending any new discoveries of fundamental physics is coming to an end. So eventually someone will have to catch up. So I guess in regards to how fast we get things to process, I mean, I guess the real question becomes, and maybe Luthemplar knows more than I do, obviously, this is sort of his area of interest, is that I guess that's why the big fight for technology these days is over quantum computing. It seems to be like the last big, fight that we're going. I don't know. We'll see. Do you have any thoughts?
Luthemplar. Yeah, I basically want the Hottentots to rule. I want Hottentot technology to take over everything. At which point I will be, you know what? Just give it to them. Hottentots with crowns on. Hottentot technology, and that is what's going to carry us further. They can open up a wormhole in a New York minute.
Let them have it, I guess, if that comes to it. Although I'm much more, I think, techno-skeptical. I don't think that we should be.
I'm techno-skeptical about your Hottentot hypothesis. Sorry.
I'm not. I liked Dave's article for a reason, because I see where we're going, and I'm like, yeah, none of that shit, please. Machiavelli sucks to go, says base stream for $1.99 US. Well, it's always a base stream anytime I get to have Semiogogue on. And then Munchie Wolf for $3 US. He sends this via Entropy. He says, always enjoy seeing yourself and Semiogogue post on Twitter. And so, Twitter's a fun place to get the ideas out, shitpost, have ideas, whether it's who would you hammer or just simply doing a thread about the Speaker of the House.
Whom would you hammer? Yeah, your Speaker of the House thread was good. I retweeted that for good and sufficient cause.
Yeah, we're actually speaking of Speaker of the House, they finally got McCarthy elected. It took 15 votes, but they finally got him elected as Speaker.
McCarthy got elected.
Yeah, he finally got it.
Oh, these wretched dogs succumbed. Oh my God.
So
do we know what they got in exchange?
I do not know. But what I can promote is that Ryan Turnipseed and I are going to be talking about this event, because this is historical. This is the first time in 100 years that the U.S. House of Representatives took more than one vote to get a Speaker of the House. And it's been times of great political, uncertainty that we have multiple votes, whether it's in the 1920s or prior to the starting of the Civil War or now. It's kind of interesting. So selected, not elected. Well, ain't that the truth? But we'll be talking.
I like the fact that D is showing up to wreak havoc in your chat the way I am as a guest.
I love it.
We're working together. I will totally endorse Mr. Turnipseed, and we'll tune in for this discussion, because he's very, very good with American history, as are you, Prude, and everybody should definitely check out that stream.
Well, apparently, and last but not least, he replies again. Luthemplar says, I read McCarthy's lips, and he quite frankly asked, what do you want from me, to Gates? Total begging. Well, we'll see. I mean, you did hold him hostage for, 3 or 4 days now? So hopefully they get something good out of it. That's all I can suggest.
See nothing. Absolutely nothing. If they didn't announce what they got for their trouble, what they got was a padded wallet, and the rest of us got a screwing. It's like out of Candide, that scene where he tries to kiss Cunegonde, and then he gets he's forced to run the gauntlet, and they whip him with the ramrods out of the muskets, and kick him in the ass. And he stumbles to the ground after running the gauntlet, and he said, "What is this thing called love, for which I have received one kiss and 100 kicks in the ass?" Yeah, if they didn't announce that they got anything,
Well,
then
apparently
all that
they
happened was
did.
they did.
I will just read some of it. So, because I'm pulling up from the Dallas Morning News, apparently what they had gotten. So one of the things that they said was, um, what they were, what did they vote for here? It says, including the reinstatement of a long-standing House rule that would allow any single member to call a vote to oust him from office, the speakership. So they kind of at least have some kind of sort of Damocles over his head to play along with the games that they want in that regard. So I know that there was some stuff that they were talking about today about like a new church committee to have more disclosures about what happened on January 6th, 2021. So, I mean, we'll see. But I guess we'll get more news tomorrow. But that's some interesting stuff, to say the least.
Indeed, happening here live on air, ladies and gentlemen.
And apparently in a reduced defense budget. So that's pretty interesting. There you go.
Right on, right on.
Yeah. Imagine being such a horrible, unlikable POS. It takes a historical precedent to get you selected. Well, you know, you could say the same thing about what happened in November 2 years ago. So, but yes. Well, with that, Oliver, do you have anything last minute thought? Oh, never mind. Here we go. Zood for $5. We thank you so much for your contribution. Keeps the channel going. He says, if deglobalization is going to be the new order of the day, how will big business square this with their natural inclination to find new consumers? And then he also says, sorry for the late theory cell question when everyone is having fun. No, this is good. This is good. It's a good question. Well, like we said earlier on in our discussion, it doesn't seem like deglobalization in regards to, you know, culture or Americanization, the latest, you know, Marvel film or cape shit that we see on Netflix. It's not like that's going to disappear. So, I mean, I think when you have a greater interconnected world, I think it's easy to find new consumers because, you know, a year ago, I had a conversation last Saturday, on a Saturday with Conscious Caracal in Sven Zila, South Africa, a friend of both of our channels. And he told me he was walking downtown Pretoria and he heard, you know, someone that looks just like him speak perfect Americanized English. It doesn't matter about how you and I may think about the culture war, things like that. As long as they can sell this shit somewhere else and they get the viewership and they get the money and they get the contracts, the business keeps rolling in because then you can localize the language, you can do dubbing, you can film in other locations. It'll be easy to find new consumers. And if anything else, if they need to contract, which a lot of businesses are already doing because of the oncoming recession, if Amazon firing like 18,000 people or Twitter with the Elon stuff firing half their staff, a lot of these businesses can survive just fine, you know, if they have to contract. But yeah, it's things that come to my mind in that regard. Anything that you have there?
No, I agree with you entirely. All I would do is amplify what you said, which is that they've got, you know, hordes of willing consumers to be crossing borders who will be perfectly happy to take a break from like dropping, you know, fake slugs into vending machines or working out welfare fraud to consume. So it doesn't. Yeah, I don't.
It's like that bit from Malcolm in the Middle where Hal's talking to like all the bodybuilders. He's like, you do this all the time? He's like, yeah, as long as those disability checks keep coming in.
Right.
Melon donates $2, says keep donating so they can't go to bed. Well, joke's on you. We're both night owls, so I mean, we'll take your money. I'm not gonna,
there's no sleeping. Pay Prude. He needs to get a new walking gun and he needs to get a new bandana for that totally patriarchal dog he's got. That dog like looking off into the distance with its chin raised.
He is a good boy, but he is a good dog. That's for sure. Machiavelli sucks to go says, I will keep sending chat so you can't sleep. Well, again, I'm not going to say no. Like, by all means, pay me. I'm not upset. Geo says, Alex Kashuta speaks perfect American English in Romania. So think about that. Well, I mean, yeah.
I'm pretty sure she lived
She
in the
doesn't
U.S.
speak
for a
perfect.
while.
She's got an accent, but I mean, she's also pretty. I mean, she's
Her
in the
accent is
system.
very light.
Very light.
She does a good job. But yeah, she lived in the United States, didn't she?
I do not know. Although
chat tell us.
Yeah, chat tell us if she's been. I mean, she's been to America to speak at the NatCon conferences. But I mean, by all means, if she's been to America before, cool. But I don't know her personal background well enough. I enjoy the people she interviews and the essays that she's given at the NatCon stuff for her speeches. But yeah, I'll say this because I would like to eventually be interviewed by her because she's interviewed all of my mutuals but me. So.
Nope, I've not been on there either. I have we worked something out. I just have to get my act together beforehand. I want to come with something new.
But our friend David Carlson says that they met at NatCon. Very lovely. Well, that's good. And then DC Perspective sends $5. Says no sleep till Brooklyn. So there you go. I appreciate it nonetheless. But now Mr. D is just bragging about his American accent because I am in America. Well, that's a new one. I didn't know that we had regular old Americas now.
We've got two Americas.
Yeah.
And yeah, one of them is
John D.
One of them is a redheaded giant. Yeah.
You mentioned the walking gun, and then look at this. Paul W. Hall for $9.99 says, "Here's to the gun fund. Get yourself a Tokarev or some other hot cartridge piece."
Oh man, you need trying to make fun of your walking gun. Your walking gun is eminently sensible, and if you can find it, my old buddy Tim, before he died, kept telling me I need to get myself. I don't know how many. It's at least 8, but it might be 12. If I'm not like crazy, there are apparently some old Harrington and Richardson 22 revolvers that hold a lot more 22s. And if you can get one with a long enough barrel, man, yeah, your walking gun is totally stylish. I can see you cruising through the Texas night with the good boy with you, ready to deal with all comers.
I mean, Harrington and Richardson used to do a long barrel 7-shot 22 way back in the day. But I mean, those are basically antiques now. I mean,
what are you talking about? It's not like they're going to blow up from a 22.
No, I'm just saying. I'm just simply saying they're old.
Yeah, as long as somebody didn't dry fire them like crazy. And there is a Smith & Wesson, but it cost a pretty penny. That is, I think it's an 11-shot 22 revolver. That's just so sweet. But I like the idea of you having. You need a walking gun from the 60s to go with the mustache.
I should. So one of these days. Oh, for God's sakes, people.
The money just keeps coming, Prude. Squeeze them.
I shouldn't complain. I'm very thankful. Wave Greetings says, "Thanks for the stream, gentlemen. Well, we're here for your education and for our pleasure and for your money." With Templar once again says, "I enjoyed learning today that East German re-engineered the AK-74, something called the Vega STG 940, and it was supposedly the best quality." Well, now I have to do research. There you go. Well, that sounds like a fun time. Okay.
I'm just watching D in the chat.
D, you guys are well. I would say you're evil, but I mean, I don't care. I have to stay up late. Zood for $2 says, "This is the $2 I didn't need $1 to Geo's birthday chance." Yeah, Geo was having fun on the Digital Archipelago yesterday because he joined my birthday stream. He didn't do anything for his because we share the same birthday on the 23rd. So we were just having a good time there. And then Sam153 for $5 Canadian just says money gained. I'm very happy with that. So thank you all. Greatly appreciate it.
Well, now wait a minute. How much is $5 Canadian?
I don't know. The economy has been such garbage that I'm pretty sure
I'd look into that before I'd say thank you.
You're awful.
Sorry, no, I don't know. Just around. How much is it? I just want to complain the way AA
does. It's $3.75.
$3.75.
See,
$3.75.
It didn't used to be like, where a book cost $10 US and then it would be like $20.99, Canadian. I remember those days, good times. Just like, man, it sucks to have money again.
Yeah, once upon a time when we had a strong currency, right?
Yeah, once
Yeah.
upon a time. Once upon a time. But, so be it. So be it. Nice to see GOC thing in the chat. But today, depending on where you live, because it's also the 7th, so if you are in Russia, Merry Christmas. And for the rest of you, I hope that you had a wonderful feast of the Epiphany. I have been lately ending my streams with Prudent Observations, Semiogogue, with reading from Scripture. But before you fuckers...
You're going to have to read a super chat before you deal with the Word of God, boy.
Yeah, before I deal with Scripture, y'all are going to make me read your money. He says, I got a decent 10K stuck in the EU.
Wait, are you a Calvinist?
No.
Sorry. Read the money.
Read the money. Says I got a decent 10K stuck in the EU, and I'm just going to leave it there until after the war. Should double in value. Yeah, well, it's not a half bad idea, but look at you with your 10K sitting there and just flexing your money. What's it like to worship Mammon, Cringewalker? Let us know. I do have to laugh at the idea that the euro is going to go up in value if this war ends. Because who knows? But
doesn't look good, yeah.
It doesn't look good. Okay, well, since you are all done.
No, wait. Last one in. This is your last chance, ladies and gentlemen, to send him more money. However, I must respond. I wouldn't have bothered responding, but DC Perspective has a wrench, which means it must be a buddy of yours. It says, what does Calvinism have to do with it? I'm just talking about how, as Calvin observed, if God loves you, he'll give you money. And if he doesn't, he won't give you money. That seems like pretty straightforward Calvinist doctrine. If you received money, it's because God loved you. And if you didn't, it's because he didn't. Sorry, I don't have any thorough understanding of Christianity. I just felt like I should answer. Sorry, you got another $2 out of it.
Oh God, the more you give, the longer he lives. Well, I mean, that's where most of the money goes, anyways, is to paying for medications and
keep my friend Prude alive.
I am doing fine, and I have a job, and it all works out. But I mean, you guys just make sure that the out-of-pocket expenses don't go anywhere. God loves me, which is why I'm giving it to you. You guys are awful. I just wanted to read the Bible.
Give me money.
Account. I'm in Lambda's Discord server, and someone's going to see this and be like, well, actually, this is what Calvinism really means. So, I mean, I'm not a Calvinist, but, and then Melon for $2 says frogs. Well, that is a part and parcel for the Prudentialist brand, to where even if you look up the word Prudentialism, my profile picture will show up right next to the Wikipedia article of Prudentialism. It's fantastic. And in fact, we can prove it right now. It's fantastic. Oh, no, well, not anymore. I can't make that claim anymore. They finally changed it. That's unfortunate, but so be it. It works out that way. But with that being said, since there are no more...
No, you're not done.
God bless America. 270 is always fun when you're hunting, but I mean, if I want to just go out and go shoot at the range, then 5.56 it is.
Check him out. Wait a minute. Don't I get to answer for Caliber?
Yes, you do. What is your favorite?
Well, it's really, I bounce back and forth between 22 long rifle and 45 ACP, just because I still carry a 45.
That's my favorite meme that I've seen in the last year or two has been 9mm kills the body, but 45 ACP kills the soul.
I might actually finally switch to 9 because they've got some decent double stack 9mm handguns that are 1911 based, right? So I don't have to relearn all that crap. Before my buddy Tim died, he was always like, beware the one gun man. Beware the man who's always had one gun, so everything about it comes naturally for him. So if I'm going to switch to something more reasonable, at least has to have all the... Anyway, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I carry a 380 as my concealed, but yeah, I get it. Machiavelli sucks to go. I give you this, so God gives me more. Well, as Benjamin Franklin says, God loves those who help themselves. So
he must be a Catholic right there. That's works. That's the doctrine of works, man. That's like helping out your fellow man. your reward will be in heaven.
Well, Machiavelli sucks to go. Let us know in the chat if you're a Catholic. Skeptical Wave says, "Oh gosh, you're still going." That's how I feel. It's good to see you, Robot Man. It was nice to have you on the New Year's stream because it's like you never go on. You've been on Semiogogue's and mine, and I think that's it. I haven't seen you anywhere else, so it's always a pleasure. Jacob for $5 US says, "Don't go to Semiogogue for theology."
Wise words. Yeah, wise words. I don't know. I've screwed everything up this evening. So yeah, pay him. Pay Prude. He just had his birthday, for crying out loud.
Oh, and they were generous then. They were generous.
Absolutely. Wring the blood from the stone.
Okay. Oh, apparently, clean it up, Janny's clean the frogs from Wikipedia. That was fun for a couple of weeks where you looked up Prudentialism right next to the Wikipedia article on Google showed my profile picture, and I felt like I had made it. I had culture jammed the system, and they couldn't stop me.
Fucking culture jamming. That's an old phrase from Kalle Lasson and Adbusters. Oh my God, I hate the fact it still survives. Oh! Go on, sorry.
So yeah, apparently Machiavelli sucks to go he says I'm not against Catholics, so I guess he's not Catholic in that regard. So, all right. You guys are done. We're going to bed.
That's it. Speak now or forever hold your peace. The boy wants to read scripture.
It's how these streams have ended since we started doing Prudent Observations when we changed the names since I don't do it on Sundays anymore. But anyways, so even though it's technically the 7th, today was the 6th. It was Epiphany for the Catholics, Christmas Eve for the Russians, but for us on the new calendar in the Orthodox, it is Theophany, representation of Christ's baptism. So that's exactly what we're going to read, which is Matthew 13 through 17. So to read here. Then Jesus came to Galilee and John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. And John tried to prevent him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you. Why are you coming to me?" But Jesus answered and said to him, "Permit it to be so now, for thus it is fitting to fulfill all righteousness." And then he allowed him. And when he had been baptized, Jesus came up immediately from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened up to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove, alighting upon him. And suddenly a voice came from heaven, saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." So with that is how we will end things for tonight. I hope that you are all doing well, whether you're having Christmas on the old calendar or simply enjoying January and New Year's. 12 days of Christmas are over. We can take off of our wonderful Santa Claus hats on our Twitter profiles and things like that. And so with that, all ladies and gentlemen, go subscribe to Semiogogue. And if not, you can always buy his poetry, or I'm going to shill it again. You can go buy his great book, which I'd like to have you on to talk about. Because all the books that I've read by my friends, I've interviewed the authors. So by all means, go buy his works, go support him, and go be a fan. I support Semiogogue with my money. You should do the same, since you've all been so generous with me. And stay tuned to his channel. He's going to talk about Australia pretty soon. So things will be pretty exciting there. We get to find out what the hell's going on in the Great Down Under.
And get some more Chris Gard.
That's true. Chris Gard's great. I love him. Yes, he does. This is his book right here. He's got this, and you have 2 books on poetry, right?
I got 1 book of poetry. I got that one, and I got this thing called Traditional Marking Systems that I contributed to and helped edit. And there's some articles, but there's more on the way.
There's even better. Even better.
Yes. Thank you for the plug, Prude.
This is his book, and I would recommend it. I was one of the first ones that I bought that were written by my friends online, and one of my favorites. So you have a written or a verbal affirmation. It's a good book. So, and apparently Mr. D is on Twitter Spaces right now if you're interested there. So with that, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, hell
yeah. Well,
we'll be there. We'll be there next.
You're welcome.
Yeah, you're welcome, Mr. D. But all right, everyone. I wish you all a good night, and we'll see you soon next time. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Prude.